Across the mountain range of time, there are many mysterious domains which have yet to be explored. Being acquainted with the most prominent historical landmarks is certainly helpful to the curious traveler in search of lost time. But as one makes their way through the narrow labyrinth of ancient myths and memories, there seems not to be any guiding thread which will lead out and up to the noble peak of time itself. We are not altogether lost, however, for we have at least a handful of techniques which we can use to navigate the complex topography of history. As Michel Foucault says, historians, like philosophers, have been accustomed to a history which takes in only the summits, the great events. But today, unlike the others, historians are becoming more willing to handle ignoble materials. For these recent historians, history is less about emphasizing continuity and removing discontinuity, and more about surveying the different and sometimes contradictory domains which constitute nothing less than our own time. We have reached a point where time is once again no longer bound to a single form of representation. The unboundedness of our history serves as a constant reminder that there is an overabundance of things to be known. As externalized knowledge increases around us, we grow more aware of our own ignorance. The gift of technology appears to come at the expense of insight and understanding, and this is precisely one of the main themes to be found in the old myth of Prometheus. Throughout these videos, I have tried to demonstrate how what Friedrich Nietzsche calls the monumental species of history can be a valuable point of reference, even though it has certainly lost its vigor. According to Nietzsche, a monumental history had to deal in approximations and generalities, making what is dissimilar look similar. And because it was focused on only a handful of individual embellished facts, the past itself suffered harm, insofar as entire segments of it were ignored and allowed to flow away, unremembered. The point is not that we should monumentalize monumentality, since this would be to ignore what life means for us today. But as our little model of Alexandria showed us, it is still possible to imitate the monumental style in order to revitalize some of the more ignoble personalities like Timon of Phlius, who have yet to be given any careful attention. Many parallels exist between our world and that of the Alexandrian age. Very much like us, whether they were fully aware of it or not, Alexandrian scholars were in a unique position to survey all sorts of information which had never before been accessible all at once. The scribes developed a mode of reading and thinking in response to the rapidly increasing transmission of media, which continues to this day. With the proliferation of texts, a very specific form of history came into being, which Nietzsche identified as Antiquarian. Texts were compiled, copied, commented upon, and classified in such a way as to create a sense of reverence for documents of the past, which accorded equal importance to every historical detail, no matter how trivial or mundane. In opposition to the cyclical view of time where events are a sort of rekindling of an ever-changing fire, in the mode of Alexandrian thought, the past, which included historical and mythological events, came to be seen as both an ever-receding horizon and an extremely proximate reality, contained in the material medium of text. A distance was opened up between the present and the past that could only be bridged by the linear time of reading. The study of history in the West has been more or less an afterimage of the Alexandrian period, with its usual emphasis on maintaining a link with the past through various successions. The difference between criticism and commentary and the silent but powerful delineation between canonical texts to be treated and the rest of the archive. But it has to be remembered that the image we have of Alexandria itself is only a partial one, constructed out of inherited records and filtered through a modern lens. There is no single unbroken thread leading from the ancient world to the present, unless we count the overlapping of many separate threads to be a continuity. If we must banish discontinuity, then it is the very idea of continuity, with all its inevitable distortions and inaccuracies, which we can trace back to the home of the Muses. It would appear as if the activities and attitudes that were sparked in that institution have spread and continue to proliferate within the global and transnational educational systems of today. If modern systems of knowledge could lay claim to a common heritage, the complicated and diverse history of the Egyptian city of Alexandria would certainly be part of it. There are, of course, many other histories which have not had a chance to be told in full, or even at all, which would likely shed more light on our situation if they could be investigated as thoroughly as Western classical scholarship investigated itself. But the urge to locate a shared origin for everything is nothing other than the inheritance of the Alexandrian technology of reading. The idea of restoring lost knowledge and power after the death of Aristotle's most successful student was what motivated the Ptolemies to pour their wealth into the museum and foster an entire community of bibliophiles. Ironically, or perhaps appropriately, this center for the recovery of the past has come to symbolize the very thing that allowed it to function in the first place. The shining beacon of Pharos not only attracted seekers of knowledge, but also lit their imaginations with the notion that truth could be retrieved from the darkness of the past. But it's precisely the idea of a gap where truth should be, the idea of lost knowledge and power, the feeling of a fundamental lack of access to the past, which motivated and united one intellectual movement after another. In a sense, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern age could not have developed into what they became without the fertile Egyptian soil of the Alexandrian love for esoteric knowledge. Yet as Timon was able to remind us, the basis of this development was nothing more than a royally commissioned collection of scribblings on papyrus. Most serious historians no longer try to impose grand narratives or notions of progress, and instead confine themselves to assembling reminders of contingent events. We moderns, or postmoderns, often feel nostalgia for the old monumental form of history. Only partial images can be pieced together from our documents. And these are not always especially informative because their elusive unity seems to depend solely on our own ability to imagine an entire world that is forever vanished. Taking our documents at face value, it's quite rare to find any common threads or grand schemes running through them. We have learned that the events of the past have no value in themselves besides whatever values we artfully project onto them. It's easy to believe our projections are a simple mixture of subjective fantasy and accident. But it wasn't very long ago that there existed an opinion that all art, whether practical or purely for the sake of beauty, was governed by an objective power of necessity, which was to be found in the very laws of nature itself. A great reconciler of differences, Ralph Waldo Emerson once said that the power of nature predominates over the human will in all works of even the fine arts. Every work of art, in proportion to its excellence, partakes of the precision of fate. Whatever is beautiful rests on the foundation of the necessary. This strict dependence of art upon material and ideal nature, this adamantine necessity which it underlies, has made all its past, and may foreshow its future history. Like an ancient artifact plucked from its original context, this sentiment that art is bound to a supremely rational law of nature strikes us as odd and perhaps somewhat naive. We immediately notice a stark contrast between Emerson's view of art as the natural outcome of a sort of instinctual rationalism and our own belabored efforts to see any necessity or unity in the partial images that we come up with whenever we do history. In any case, these miscellaneous and seemingly arbitrary representations that we make are plainly the result of an artistic ability, which can only truly thrive within an atmosphere of playful and daring curiosity. The question is whether such an atmosphere can still be sustained, or if, on the contrary, we have arrived at the point where we are obligated to abandon art in favor of a deadly serious scientific outlook. If Prometheus gave our ancestors fire and taught them to control it, that fire now seems to be spreading uncontrollably. We don't have to imagine a dark sci-fi future in order to see how technology has established both external and internal relations to human beings, which have dramatically altered what it means to be a subject. Our technologies of media have so perfectly imitated our own limitations that the antiquated notion of a unified self is almost entirely unbelievable. Even with access to more information than ever before, so much is hidden and completely ignored due to algorithms and the physical limitations of hardware. What all this results in is the impression that the world is fundamentally fragmented and in pieces, mechanically dissociated, and only capable of stamping us with words and thoughts which reinforce a deep mistrust of anyone or anything that claims to be original or comprehensive. We are constantly presented with an artless view of the world, which simultaneously stands entirely outside of history and exhaustively repeats it without being aware. The capacity of the aesthetic sense to unify and embellish disparate facts is short-circuited by the disunity and disharmony of the modern world. Even if we can no longer believe in the myth of a sovereign subject, there are still signs of stable aesthetic structures in our day-to-day lives which often go unnoticed because of their familiarity. The technology we call reading still holds sway over us and has been in effect for at least a few millennia. We unconsciously skip over particular words and events and fill in their meanings according to a series of inferences that stem from an assumption that continuity must somehow exist between things that are as dissimilar as possible. Despite the obvious discontinuities and gaps in our knowledge, a programmatic unity imposes itself whenever we attempt to engage with the various forms of media that characterize the present. In an almost pathological way, we tend to ignore the living contradictions that resist a mechanical interpretation, and perceive the present as a unified and single point of reference, bound to an adamantine chain of causes which secretly underlie historical contradictions. Despite the fact that we can never really say what the present is without recourse to those same contradictions that we find throughout history, we are driven, in effect, to make monuments out of our documents. The artifice of the technological present may be compared to a screen, which simultaneously displays and conceals information in a manner not unlike the human psyche. We have indeed made our world in our own image, And like Narcissus, we are unable to tear away from its dreamlike beauty. We are all artists, whether we realize it or not. And what we make of history will depend on the material we have at hand. The Promethean gift of technology may have made art possible, but art makes history actual. Our media allows us to indirectly access this history while also preventing us from escaping its influence altogether. It at once holds and hides the history we feel so often detached from. This mystic writing pad that is media represents for us both the limit and the foundation of all possible history. What the opaque surface of our technologically mediated present reveals is that we are not yet entirely free from the artistic need to create myths. The most important myth of the present may be the belief that this medium provides us with an open window through which we can clearly view the past. Although in reality, the image we see before us may be nothing other than a reflection in a mirror.